I've been thinking a lot about my Aunt Vita, who turned 100 years old in April. She lived in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is my hometown. And she grew up there with her 9 younger brothers and sisters, including my mom, my grandmother, who came from Spain, and my grandfather, who was undocumented from Mexico and came to work on the railroad. I remember the stories of her first job after she quit school in the 8th grade to help out my grandparents. She was working as a housekeeper for a family on the other side of the tracks. Later on, she worked with her husband, my Uncle Mario, in the restaurant business, and they had a concession trailer where they sold hamburgers and hot dogs and snow cones and popcorn at the local Native American fiestas. After my uncle suffered a debilitating stroke that left him completely paralyzed, my Aunt Vita dutifully took care of him for 10 years. And after he died, I remember her working at the nearby hair salon as a receptionist well into her 90s. The best word to describe my Aunt Vita is fierce. She was a total badass. In fact, I have no doubt that in another world, she would have been CEO of a Fortune 500 company. My Aunt Vita passed away 9 days ago on her own terms, peacefully, in the same tiny house she lived in for decades. A child of the Depression, she lived a humble life, but she had everything she needed and was surrounded by love and family who cared for her. Still, I can't help but think what growing old might have looked like for my Aunt Vita, my grandmother, millions of other women under different circumstances. What if they had been able to care for their children or their aging parents or their sick husbands without losing their jobs? Or what if they had access to retirement savings accounts that followed them throughout their working lives? Or what if the threat or reality of medical debt wasn't constantly looming over them? How would their lives be different? I want to tell you about another woman in my life, my mother-in-law, also a badass. She immigrated to the U.S. in the late 70s from the Dominican Republic. As a single mom raising her son, my husband, she didn't have the luxury of 529 accounts for his education or retirement account for her later years, and you can forget home ownership. She was busy trying to piece things together for herself, her kids, her parents, her siblings and nieces and nephews, and so many others in her community. After all, women are more likely than ever before to be the sole breadwinners and lenders of first resort in their families. She's 72 now, and she lives 3,000 miles away from us in a Latino immigrant community in New York City called Washington Heights. As she grows older, I'm honestly not sure what she would do if we weren't able to help out with her rent. We're lucky enough to be able to help, but I know most people don't have that luxury. I'd like for you all to take a minute and think about a woman in your life, maybe someone who's taken care of you, a mother, a grandmother, or a nanny, a wife, or a daughter. Now think about that woman in her later years at age 80 or 90. What do you wish for her? We may all have different things on that list, but I'm pretty sure we can all agree that we don't wish for her to be scrounging for food at food pantries or cleaning houses when her body can no longer take it, or forgoing a critical health treatment because she can't afford it. She should be able to age comfortably and with dignity. Isn't that what the so-called golden years are all about anyway? In our society, that requires wealth. Statistically speaking, the woman you're thinking about right now is unlikely to have what she needs to live comfortably in her later years. And that's because of the women's wealth gap. If she's the average woman in the US, she earns 79 cents for every dollar earned by her male counterpart. But it might shock you to know that she owns just 32 cents on the dollar. So that means if you take all of the money she has and the value of everything she owns, like a house or a car, you put it all together, it adds up to just 1/3 of what the average man has if you take all of his money and everything he owns. This is a disturbing and often overlooked disparity that's caused by systemic barriers like the tax code and traditional gender roles, like the fact that women take more time outside of the workforce because they're caring for family members. And if you add race to the equation, it makes this disparity even more disturbing. If the woman that you're thinking of is Black or Latina, she owns just pennies on the dollar compared to white men and white women. Now, public policies and private practices, like slavery, Jim Crow laws, and redlining, just to name a few, have systematically shut out women and people of color from building wealth in this country. And it's worth noting that the examples of systemic discrimination are not all distant history. It wasn't until 1950 that domestic workers and farm workers were included in our Social Security system, the primary government support for older Americans. And it wasn't until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 that women could access credit in their own names without relying on their husband to co-sign on a credit application, no matter how much money she made. These gaps are the result of biased market forces, which means this big wealth problem that we have on our hands isn't about fixing people, it's about fixing systems. Now, the bad news is that the problem is deeply rooted. There are multiple and complex systems at play. But the good news is that we've addressed systemic inequality in our country before. Think about civil rights laws and women's suffrage as examples. Change is possible, if not always immediate or straightforward. I want to just back up a bit. What do I mean by wealth anyway? It's not some impossible standard that only the 1% of our society has. In my professional world, we refer to it as assets, the money and things that you own minus what you owe. So it's really about whether your grandma has enough retirement savings to provide for herself in her later years without depending on the kindness of strangers, or her kids who may be struggling with mortgages and kids of their own. It's about a single mom who has the resources to get her car fixed after it's broken down. So now she can get to work instead of losing her job and pick her kids up from school. In my family, it was our home, which was refinanced 17 times at last count, and was the asset that my parents leveraged over and over again to send all 5 of us to Harvard. For my mother-in-law, her wealth is the amount of money she's able to stash away, $5 here, $10 there for an emergency or birthday presents. It's the money she used to make sure that my husband had everything he needed when he was growing up. And that allowed him to go on to have an Ivy League education and a successful career. Now, given the needs and challenges surrounding my mother-in-law, that nest egg she builds up is always short-lived. Just as soon as she's got it, it's gone, and she has to start over again. If you look up the etymology of wealth, it comes from the Middle English word welle, which means well-being. So I'm not talking about multiple mansions and financial advisors for my mother-in-law as she grows older. I'm talking about security and comfort. I'm talking about having access to the tools and supports she needs to live comfortably in her later years. Far too many people, and women of color in particular, don't have access to the resources and supports they need to build wealth. Women are making less than men over their lifetimes, And they lack tools like access to retirement savings accounts, safe and affordable credit, protection from predatory lenders, unbiased financial advice at key points in their lives, and tax benefits that subsidize savings and investment. As a consequence, more and more older women of color are aging in poverty. Nationally, over half of older adults are barely meeting the basic standard of living. And for the remaining half, many are just one major life event away, a job loss or a health crisis, from plunging into poverty. If you break it down by gender, we know that older women are almost twice as likely to be living in poverty as older men. And they make up 2/3 of the elderly poor. If you break it down by gender and race, we know that 1/5 of all Black and Latina women 65 and over are living in poverty. Now, here in California, our older population is set to double over the next 2 decades. Yet our state has the highest poverty rate in the country for people 65 and older. Their median personal income is just over $21,000 a year. Imagine living on that amount of money as you grow older. That's less than 5 months of rent for your average one-bedroom apartment here in San Francisco. And a new report just released in the last week shows that seniors are the largest group of borrowers in California that are using payday loans. In my mind, the fact that so many older adults, particularly women of color, are living in poverty is an outrage. And that's reason enough for addressing wealth inequality in this country. But I'd like to offer one more reason why we should care. Closing this wealth gap helps all of us. According to Professors Manuel Pastor of the University of Southern California and Chris Benner of the University of California, Davis, greater economic equality creates greater regional prosperity. It lifts all of us up. So closing the wage gap, which is one of the biggest drivers of the wealth gap, would cut the poverty rate in half for working women and their families and add nearly $500 billion to our nation's gross domestic product. So really, an investment in the women's wealth gap is actually an investment in our national economy as well. Given the huge systemic issues that need fixing, we need a broad menu of solutions to start tackling them. On the income side, we need to keep pushing for a living wage, pay equity, affordable childcare, and paid family leave. And on the wealth side, we can start with 2 things, retirement and the tax code. First, we need to support new strategies that expand women's access to retirement accounts. State programs like Secure Choice here in California, for example, that enables smaller employers to give their workers access to accounts. And portable benefits, which means creating a system in which retirement savings accounts and other benefits like workers' comp or unemployment insurance are tied to an individual instead of being rigidly connected to an employer. So that means independent contractors, like your house cleaner, or maybe the Lyft driver who brought you here today, could build wealth too. As policymakers debate tax reform, we need to keep asking the question, who benefits? If working women and their families don't benefit, we need to push back. 2/3 of households, many of them led by working women, don't itemize on their taxes, which means that they don't benefit from deductions, like the home mortgage tax deduction. Working women and their families are much more likely to benefit from tax credits, especially if they're refundable. We should expand things like the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit, which means more money in the pockets of low and moderate income working people through reduced tax liability or a refund. Really, there are many ways to start tackling this, but a new national effort called Closing the Women's Wealth Gap Initiative, led by the amazing Heather McCullough, gives me hope that we will get there. Certainly not today or tomorrow, But I believe that our daughters and our granddaughters will have a better chance of aging comfortably and with dignity. At the most basic level, wealth is really about well-being. I know what I would wish for my Aunt Vaa, my mother-in-law, my mom, myself. I'd like for you all to go back to the woman that you thought about at the beginning, your Aunt Vaa equivalent. Remember what you wanted for her later in life. The solutions to the wealth gap are big and messy and complex, but they exist. And we can all start by inserting this topic into our personal and national narratives, right out there with jobs and healthcare and climate change. And that will get us one step closer to making those later years truly golden for everyone. Thank you.